Well, hello everyone. This is Mark Tinsley, and you're joining me on Clean Slate, where we talk about the real issues of the church with real people through real talk. And we're going to start that right now. And folks, again, welcome to Clean Slate. I'm your host, Mark Tinsley. And on Clean Slate, we talk about the problems, the misconceptions, the inconsistencies of the church. And we do it not just to identify them, but to correct them. And tonight we're going to be talking about contemporary Christian music. Now, when we hear the term contemporary Christian music, sometimes people say, well, you shouldn't have any music in the church. Music has no place in the church. Or some people will say, only the good old hymns, the good old gospel hymns from way back should be in the church. Well, folks, we want to ask the question, is this true? And what is the role of Christian music in our lives of faith? Well, folks, to help us answer that question tonight, we have with us Duncan Wood. Duncan is an author, a songwriter, a musician. He's done so many different things when it comes to music. He's the author of the book, The Perfect Guitarist. He's also had many albums over the years. One was called The Answer by Cuts Road, where he had a nationally hit song called Maelstrom. He's also produced In the Flame, and It All Starts Here with the Duncan and Danielle Band. And he's getting ready to release a new album here in the days to come called Love, Grace, and the Pursuit of Happiness. Duncan, thanks for being with us this evening.
I'm glad to be here.
Well, Duncan, as you well know, we start our segment with the first segment we have here on Clean Slate is what we call the gut. And so the question is very simple. What's your gut reaction when you hear contemporary Christian music?
Honestly, it's a combination of both fear and anticipation. And I think that that's probably justified based on the many changes that have taken place in Christian music over the hundreds of years that I'm more aware of. I'm not sure exactly what went on prior to Pope Gregory in the 12th century with the Catholic Church, but I know that music has been a part of things for a very long time. Now the question is, and I think that's part of what we're driving at here tonight, is what kind of relevance does the music have in helping people worship God? What feelings do they walk away with from the experience of singing or praising in whatever form it takes? And then how well does that relate to the society at large of the time period that we're talking about?
Right. So, yeah, we do. All music in the church has been contemporary at some point.
At some point.
in its life. And I think we sometimes forget that. When we look at the old hymns, we think they've been around since creation. But they haven't, and I'm sure there was criticism about a lot of these during their heydays.
And there still is.
There still is in some cases. That's right.
Well, it's certainly, I think that part of the desire to worship God finds its roots in music. And you can't blame anybody for trying. Right.
Well, you and I had a talk a couple of days ago, and you were talking about how the mind works and how music works with the mind. I think our viewers would benefit from hearing about that.
Well, if you're sure I'm not going to bore anybody to death.
I don't think so.
We need all the listeners we can get. Well, you had asked a question about misconceptions, misunderstandings, what goes on with music, and you brought up the 80s and 90s in particular.
Right.
And with what we might say early, this kind of contemporary Christian music.
Sure.
And there was a marked shift, a paradigmatic shift at that point from what had been going on before. And if I were to sum it up, it would be that the decision was made to make Christian music sound like secular music.
Right.
And the question was, well, how do we do that? Well, the first thing that they went after were the electric guitars.
Right.
And being able to make it sound like it was a hit off the radio that anybody would be listening to. So if we drop back into what are the criticisms of that, it would be that it was fairly unsatisfying to a lot of us because there was a lack of content.
Right.
Right. Now, when we go into the details of what are the things we're looking for and what is it that makes us feel like we've accomplished something personal, intimate in the process of worship.
Right.
That brings us back to the psychological side,
Right.
Which is something that all of us from Adam forward have been carrying with us all this time. We all have a brain, right, whether we use it or not. Right. We have senses, and these senses are the means whereby we're able to experience the world around us. Mm-hmm. And so when you think about it, the development of language was something that there's an argument about different kinds of, like the whales sing to each other. Right. But let's say the kind of language that I'm talking about right now is language that involves symbol think.
Right.
The ability to say a word and it's a symbol for a set of feelings or relationships. After a while, we build up a vocabulary from being more than 20, 30, 40 words to being 100, 2,000 words, mm-hmm. 10,000 words. And then we're able to actually have conversations, all in symbol think. That is the symbolic language of words,
sure,
right? So when it comes to music, now music uses lyrics, and lyrics are words,
right,
but we also have the effect of music itself as separate from lyrics or language, right? And music is more of a right brain process. Mm-hmm. If we say right brain is involved with the intuitive, empathic, pattern sensing, feelings, and the left brain being the rational, cognitive, analytical side that allows us to say 1 + 1 is 2, and we know what that means to each other, and then 2 × 2 is 4, and keep going in that direction. So language falls into the left-hand side of the brain as symbol think, but music is more right brain, feeling think. Mm-hmm. So you put those two together, and you've got the most powerful communication tool of all time.
It is pretty amazing because whereas we have different languages, here in the United States, we speak primarily English. You go into some other countries, they're going to speak other language. Yet the other side of the brain can be that bridge. The music side can be the bridge between languages. Because you hear people say, we can communicate with one another through music. It's the universal language. And I love your description of how that music side of our brain can be the bridge where we can connect with people that we don't even speak the same language.
Yeah, isn't it fascinating that people in Japan will listen to English songs?
Yes.
And other countries where other languages that are completely different than English, and yet they're very popular songs.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the things that supports that premise, that music is the great communicator.
Absolutely. Well, let's move on. You kind of already alluded to it and even started answering it, but the misconceptions that surround contemporary Christian music, because there are folks out there that, as I said in the introduction, that will say music has no place in the church. Now, those are fewer and fewer nowadays, but there are a lot of folks, a lot of churches that would say, well, the old hymns are the way to go. And they won't give, say, this contemporary Christian music that we're hearing on a lot of our radio stations today. They won't give it a chance. There's a lot of misconceptions, misunderstandings, and hang-ups over contemporary Christian music. Why do you think that is? Or what are some of the, maybe that's the question, what are some of these hang-ups and misconceptions?
Well, let's say when I was growing up, I'll draw on my own experience, and I went from church to church. I was exposed to music that was old-fashioned, bluegrass, gospel, and even older, such as hymns that were supported by and played by the founder of the Methodist Church, John Wesley.
Right.
But as you said before, there was a time when these things were radical, when they were the new music, and people had strong opinions. They didn't have records they could burn at that point, but they certainly made their displeasure known. Right. So misconceptions, I think, it comes back to how we perceive, and I'm going to grab some of my notes here because I jotted these down to help me out. So we were talking about language being the symbol, think of concepts and relationships, music being the symbol, think of feelings and patterns. So we have consciousness and unconsciousness at that point. And consciousness being our ability to be aware of ourselves as being something different than others, right?
Right.
So self, other. Now that basic awareness is what leads to a great many other understandings as time goes on. Like you have children, wonderful kids too, I might add.
Thank you.
They're all very
One of whom is producing our show today.
Isn't that incredible at her age to do this? I'm amazed. But anyhow, there are steps as children grow, what they can handle, what they can't. Now, certainly, if that's true, then that means that as parents, we have to have a wary eye on what they're taking in to help them, because we know in light of being older and having more experience, we know which things those are and which things aren't acceptable for a given age group. And yet, our societies in the last 50 years seems to have evolved to a point where we have this a difference of opinion on the validity or importance of music as it relates to growth.
Right.
And so when we look back at how we're all put together from Adam forward, we all have a mind, we have a brain, we grow, we evolve. We learn through experience. We learn through pain and pleasure.
Right.
These two basic things. You can tell my psychology training starting to come in here. But it's true. Excuse me. We learn through the pain of, like, your mom tells you, don't touch the stove. It's hot. It'll burn you. I have yet to meet a kid who doesn't touch the stove at some point and then goes, wow, Mom, you're right. Yeah. I shouldn't have touched that stove. I know, I remember when I did it.
You still have the scar, right?
I can still, yeah. But anyhow, my mother did say, I warned you, Duncan.
Yeah.
Right. But isn't that true throughout life? And one of the things that we seek to do is to be able to take advantage of superior knowledge, of somebody's superior experience.
Right.
And the better we can do that, which involves trust, then the more likely we are to avoid the unpleasant side effects of failing to listen to wisdom.
Right.
Right? So trust, faith.
Right.
And so this all goes back to our perception of the world around us. Right. And that starts with where we're looking in the first place.
Right.
If we make the same thing true for what we listen to, then we see that there's a parallel there as well. So what we're exposed to, especially when we're younger and more simplistic of a mind, then, for example, you don't go in, or at least you shouldn't be teaching a child, let's say, a Bach piece, at 2 years old. Instead, it's going to be something like This Little Light of Mine,
right.
So the same thing's true with music and its growth. So when we overexpose children at too young an age to the wrong kind of music filled with concepts and sound patterns that provoke feeling responses that they're not ready for. Like, for example, overexposing children too young to the perils of sex, is something that we see happening more and more in today's world, but was really nowhere near as big an issue back under the more controlled growing up that we saw even a half century ago.
Well, I think your point about what we expose our children to in a young age is kind of what they get used to. It's kind of we lay that foundation in the baseline for them, and so as those children grow up and become adults and become older adults, and then they're going to obviously carry that with them. And then you said something else about trust, and trust being a two-way street. And so trusting that maybe the younger generations or the music coming up may have some validity to it, and not to just rest on your foundations of old, but hey, maybe there's something of value. Though I know a lot of the criticisms, at least of older contemporary, I know that sounds oxymoronic, but older contemporary music from when I was growing up in the 80s and then in college in the 90s, was that it was so me focused. That's what people would say. I don't like contemporary Christian music because it's so me focused. The musical arrangements are simplistic. There's a lack of theological depth like in the old hymns. And I see that as somewhat of the root or that's some of the misconceptions with contemporary Christian music, because in my mind, some of the stuff that's being released now is deeper theologically. The musical arrangements are becoming more complex, if you will, and many of the songs are not me focused anymore.
I think they are becoming more relevant.
And more relevant, yeah.
Yeah, and by relevant, I mean something that causes a response. Again, if your response is good, then you have an increased amount of trust. You'll go back to the well again,
right?
And then you'll get some more.
Excellent.
And if you keep going back to the well and you keep getting rewarded for doing so, then now this becomes your experience, and your experience becomes the teacher. And now you're going to be looking for characteristics of that positive experience.
Right. So just kind of segueing then into the genesis of the misconceptions, the question is, why do these misconceptions even exist? Why are folks hesitant to enter into new worship styles? I mean, what's the...
Can I argue that perhaps using the word misconception is perhaps not appropriate, because they are observations rather.
Right.
It's only a misconception when you have information that is contrary to what you're taking in.
Right.
And what if the conception, that is the observation of people looking at music from the 80s and 90s, was valid?
Right.
Hey, look, just substituting a great guitar lick in there does not mean that I'm getting more value for my money. That is my attention, being on it. And so kids at that time that were exposed to that music were, I think, largely enthusiastic, which is why it enjoyed some success.
Sure.
But what they were reacting to was finally they had some music that sounded like what their peers were listening to in the secular world. So that on the face of it, by putting a different dress on the goat, all of a sudden the goat looks like someone or something else.
Sure.
So the clothing that something is in. Now we're talking about function versus form, right? And so let's say that the observations of that music, that it was a bit simplistic, that it repeated over and over again. There was no clear-cut construction of verse versus chorus versus bridge. It was just a mess, but it was wearing the right clothing for the time period.
Right.
And so thus it was kind of radical for people who were used to the old hymnody,
right?
That were used to the old style constructions. Now, yes, when I went in at 9-10 years old and was exposed to the music of the church, I was more than a bit horrified by most of it, because even at that age, I was starting to be able to tell the difference between good music and bad. Now, when I say bad, I'm speaking more as a composer myself and as a songwriter. What are the tricks of the trade? How do you learn to write a good song? What is going on with the meter of the line? Do you do that same meter from one verse to another? Now, I brought my guitar with me so that I could kind of give people on the other end here an idea of what I'm talking about. Would it be okay if I grab it?
Sure.
All right.
Go ahead.
Now, all I'm trying to do is support that there are observations, and then there's also a misconception. They're not necessarily the same thing. Oh boy. How am I going to do this? Okay. Hopefully that won't. I'll try putting it behind me. All right. For example, one of the greatest songs, if not the greatest song ever written, in my opinion, is Amazing Grace. Mm-hmm. Now, Amazing Grace is one of the old school, right? It's been around for hundreds of years. I'm not sure if I had it written down somewhere what the actual date of writing was, but I know it was quite a while ago. And so the first verse of Amazing Grace gives us examples that we can carry over into looking at contemporary Christian music. Mm-hmm. We can look at things done in the last 10, 20 years. We can look at stuff 200 years ago. What we're looking for are those tags, the things that will give people accurate observations. You know, like, for example, your experience tells you that when you look for certain sounds or feelings, I mean, for example, on radio, when somebody's driving down the road, mm-hmm. and they're looking for a radio station to listen to, and the music channels are up, they'll listen to a song for 2 seconds, mm-hmm. maybe 3, if you're on a good day, right. and you're feeling generous of spirit. And it doesn't take more than that to be able to make a decision. Right. And that decision's based on a bunch of tags, things that you listened for. And so if I look at it as if somebody makes it to the 10-second point, boy, you've hit the jackpot, because somebody's actually listening to what you've got to say for a moment. If you make it all the way through the whole song, then, you know, case rested. I mean, you've done your job. And so this is how businessmen look at it as well. Well, Amazing Grace had things in it that jump out to, I think, to generation after generation of validity, of meaningfulness, right. things that can relate from one decade to another, even one century to another. So Amazing Grace. Let's see. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. One of the signs of a great song is the ability to transform. That is, somebody else could come in, another songwriter. Like, say, for example, I wrote Amazing Grace. Now somebody else hears it and go, oh, I really like that. Boy, but I could do something else. One of the things that's great about the combination of lyric and music in Amazing Grace is that the words and the feelings actually parallel each other. Now, there's a word for that in English. You mentioned it the other day, onomatopoeia, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Like the buzzing of a bee.
Sure, yep.
You know, and so successful music that has both lyric and music combined does much the same thing. The words have a feel, a meter to them, and there's a poignancy, what is meant by the words. So to combine amazing and grace, one of the things I've often described grace as being is something that we're desperately grateful to have. But imagine that you're in the water surrounded by sharks, right, from a shipwreck. Well, that's a point where you really want the life buoy, the life ring that grace would provide. But did you really want to be in that position in the first place? But I mean, now, granted, once you're in the water surrounded by the sharks, you want that grace more than anything in the world. Please, Lord. You know, so grace in that sense is something that, though we're glad to have it, boy, I'd rather avoid it. But once I'm there, glad to have it yet again. So if that's the case, then that would be more of a sad feeling, you know, that I got myself into that position in the first place. I don't blame God, I blame me. Sure. I'm the one who let myself be on that ship in the first place before it went down, and now I'm in with the sharks. So that being the case, instead of being happy, amazing, that's very happy. But grace then would be sad. So now I'm the second songwriter, and I'm going to make these adjustments. I'm going to make the music parallel the words. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch. Once again, wretch is a sad thing. Wretch like me. I once was lost. So by putting the sad sound in again, lost. So we've got so far grace, wretch, lost. Guess what's coming up next? Blind.
Right.
Was blind, but now I see. Happy again.
Right.
So we can keep making changes to that ultimately flexible song.
And we've seen Amazing Grace changes made to it over the years.
Sure.
To make it probably, like you were saying a minute ago, more relevant to the generation.
Yes,
that we're
so
in.
people have played with the time signature of the piece instead of being in 1, 2, 3, 1 like the original,
Right.
changing it into 4/4, which would mean now we have even beats 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth.
Right.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things you can do.
And I think that's one of the benefits of taking. I know we do this at our church, to take some of the old hymns and contemporize them, give them the different beats, maybe some slightly different chords, to bring them into a more contemporary
Sound
element
and feel.
sound and feel.
Then
that-
it's more relevant, and that gives a positive experience and puts more positive tags on the music, which leads to coming back to the well again.
And I think that's probably one of the, when I say, the question that we talked about ahead of time, what's a corrective for these misconceptions or conceptions that we hold today that maybe are somewhat, and I'll just use the term loosely, anti-contemporary Christian music in the church.
Yeah.
And I think one of the ways that we bridge that gap is through the contemporizing some of these older hymns. Because I know in our church, a lot of times people will say when the praise team does a contemporary version, oh, I really love that because I hear the beats, I hear the new music in it, I hear the contemporary side of it, but I also hear my old music. I hear the music that I grew up with, the words of I think there's a bridge there to help people understand that it's not the contemporary Christian music. It's not the contemporary music that you are objecting to. Maybe it's just the style or the idea that this isn't what I'm used to hearing or worshiping with.
I really prefer to think of music as being good, good versus bad.
Right.
Bad is music that fails to reach the audience.
Right.
If I write a song and it doesn't make you feel like I did when I wrote it, I failed.
Right.
And yet, if I'm talking all about me, talking about Duncan, and it has no relevance or worth in somebody else's life,
absolutely.
then I'm not going to get that feeling response from you.
Right.
So writing the song is the first step. Trying to write the song so it has relevance to others.
Right.
Amazing Grace had relevance to others because, one, it was a hotbed subject at the time it was written. I believe that it was written by the captain of a slave ship
It was.
who was reforming and realizing what a terrible thing he had contributed to.
Yep.
And so, boy, did he feel what he was
Well, and I think
talking about.
And I think part of the universality of that song that spans the generations is that we all find ourselves right in that situation in life. Maybe not, we're not slave ship captains, but we've done some bad things.
But we're surrounded by the sharks.
Right. And we've had a lot of sin in our lives, and we realize that God and God's grace has brought us through and into a new relationship with Christ and into a righteousness through Him. And I think that's the beauty of songs like Amazing Grace. Well, so, wonderful. I love all this. So let's say you had a songwriter in front of you right now that was looking to write his next latest, greatest hit, contemporary Christian music hit. What's the advice you would give him? What would you say to him? Some of it maybe would be repeat of things you've already said, but if you had to list your top 3 bits of advice, what would you say?
I would say pray about it first. Truthfully, I would. Because all good things come from Him. And if you ask sincerely, He will answer. And that's something I'm still learning how to do, myself, to learn to ask. One of the things we hear about as Christians is learning how to pray for things. Stop worrying about whether it's a big thing or a little thing, but be in contact, ask for help with whatever it is you're struggling with. Right. In my case, this is becoming part of folklore around Amelon now, but you're praying for me to be able to write without stopping, to worry about who's listening, to
Right.
write a story. And so now I'm having my chance to write the same kind of music that we're talking about now, and hopefully be able to take what I've learned over the last 50 years of doing this and put it into new, great music that comes from God. And hopefully I'm being an adequate conduit. But so my advice for that young songwriter would be, and this is based mostly on the secular experience
Sure.
I've had during the last half century, but tempered by recent revelations. Pray about it first. What is it you're trying to say? What is it you feel that you need to say?
Right.
Music starts from the heart. Now we're talking about the right brain.
Sure.
The feelings and the patterns. But then the job of the left brain, the rational, cognitive, analytical, is the ability to streamline things, to be able to make sure that they fit, to be able to make sure that if you write one great verse like Amazing Grace, that then the skill comes in to writing a second great verse. What does a verse do? Well, it tells the story. What does a chorus do? What's the difference between a verse and a chorus? These are things that if I were being critical and looking at contemporary Christian music over the last, say, 50 years, that I would say there was a problem, because most of the people who've been doing most of the writing have never done any studying first.
Right.
Instead, they've felt led to write something. And for example, the slave ship captain wrote the greatest first verse I've ever seen. And yet, as we look at verse after verse on Amazing Grace, we see things starting to become much more human and much less divinely driven.
Right. Well,
And I think that can happen to anybody.
Yeah.
I mean, it's our job to try and stay true to, like, God gives us that first burst of insight, that magic, that whatever you want to call it, but out it comes. And now the job is to try and stay true to that standard.
Well, I like what you're saying. So it's obviously starting with prayer. I mean, that's a great first point. Sometimes we forget that. Starting with prayer, starting with our own study of Scripture would be the number one thing. But I like what you're saying about, secondly, what you're getting at, I think, is striving towards excellence in your music, in your lyrics, making sure that those are inspired, making sure those have theological depth, making sure that your music and your chorus and how the verses and the chorus align with one another and how the transitions go, that's done with excellence. Because I do believe that contemporary Christian music got a bad rap for a long time because it wasn't doing those things. Maybe prayer and study wasn't happening ahead of time. Musical excellence wasn't being striven for it. Lyrics were just being kind of thrown on the page, the me lyrics, because it's easy for me to say how I feel. Jesus, you make me feel this way. But telling the story of Jesus, like a song that you recently wrote, we can plug that, but telling the story of Jesus.
Plugs are appreciated.
Your song With Love. I mean, this just how that, and I know we can't play it now, but how that is truly tells the story of Jesus from birth to the cross. That's theological depth. That's not something that you're just saying, this is how Jesus makes me feel, which is very shallow. But this is who Jesus is, and this is the depth of who he was.
Right.
And I hear what you're saying there, and I think if more songwriters do, I think that more are doing that nowadays. And as that becomes more known to the public, I think you're going to see less and less resistance. I truly believe that a lot of the resistance was the shallowness of the music and the simplicity of the musical arrangements.
In fairness, though, the like, for example, if we took our hymnal of United Methodist Church and we looked through, there are some great songs. And I've been actually enjoying my last year here so much because I've been getting exposed to more and more great songs out of that hymnal.
Right.
But for every one great one,
Right.
there are a lot of others that aren't. And that's where the craftsmanship comes in. And I think God gives us the wherewithal to be able to do the good job. But then the question is the human part. How many? Like, for example, if I were painting a room, how much time do I put into the 90% preparation
Right.
and 10% slopping paint on?
Right.
And most young couples, for example, will dive in and say, oh, let's repaint our apartment or our house, and don't bother with the preparation and just slap the paint on. Oh, that looks great. And then a week later it's bubbling,
Right.
you know? And the same thing's true for songwriting. If you don't have a good foundation on which to build everything else, then you're in trouble.
Absolutely.
And so I think that's what's starting to happen now, is people are starting to take it a little more seriously. They're starting to look for backup on what they're trying to say in their song by looking in the Bible for it.
Absolutely.
You know, and instead of putting their own twist on it, trying to look at it in context. Now, the job of the songwriters is to try and make the music match the words and vice versa.
Right.
You know, and then to match over and over again. And one of the things I'm hoping to do in time to come here is, instead of writing as myself singing or, you know, for a band,
Right.
but instead to be able to start writing some of, like, going after the same subject, like where people are going to sing en masse.
Right.
And you're going to have the entire group out there, the congregation singing. So it has to be something simple enough and yet catchy enough, and then be something that they feel is relevant to them.
Absolutely.
So that means it has to be theologically solid. It has to be something that sticks in their heads and it's easy to do. I mean, that's a tough job.
It is a tough job. It's really, and you know, you're just as one final point for me. Your point of that there are songs in the hymnal that are kind of stinkers along with the great ones.
Clinkers.
And we know those songs because those are the ones that when we go to sing them on a Sunday morning, nobody knows them because they haven't been sung much through the generations. So anyway.
Yeah, I made a decision not to mention them by name.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely.
Before I came
absolutely,
in here,
absolutely.
But they have inspired me. They have inspired me to want to try and do a better job. They've made me want to do more research on it. Yeah. You know, so perhaps that was part of the goal.
There you go. Well, Duncan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate it, and thanks for gracing us with some music too.
Oh, I'm looking forward to this album coming out so that people can have a chance to hear you play drums.
Oh boy! Oh boy!
He is on this song with love. Let me tell you, world.
Well, that album is Love, Grace, and the Pursuit of Happiness, and you should be able to find it somewhere here in the near future. And folks, I just want to thank all of you who joined us live, those who are going to join us through the recording. And I hope you learned something tonight. We had a great conversation on contemporary Christian music. What is it? What's it mean? You know, why is it? Are there some misconceptions out there about it? And what can we do as singer-songwriters and as people in the church to help contemporary Christian music make its way? And I think it is, and I want to be very clear on that as I end. I think there's some wonderful contemporary Christian music out there. In fact, I listen to the Christian music stations here in the area where I live, and they're beautiful. There are many, many beautiful songs that are being written now by beautiful, beautiful artists. But there's always room for improvement. How can we improve? How can we make things better? Ultimately, not to make the songs better so that they're catchier and we sing them in the shower, but so that they communicate the gospel message to the world, so that the love, grace, mercy of Jesus Christ is communicated to a lost and dying world. That's our ultimate goal. Well, folks, thanks again for joining us tonight. We're going to be back again next week, March 12th at 8 p.m., right here on Facebook. We're going to be talking about Christian homeschooling, and one of my favorite guests of all time is going to be back, my wife, Beth Tinsley. I had to say that. That was a requirement for this. But anyway, no, Beth is going to be back with us as we look at Christian homeschooling. That is going to be a recorded message. We're not going to do that one live, but we will post it at 8 p.m. on March 12th. I hope you'll be with us then, and we'll see you next week.